Tonight's story is about a gap in history so deliberately erased that simply asking questions about it can get a person killed. 100 years, wiped almost clean from the record, guarded by the most powerful organization in the world for reasons most of that world has long since stopped questioning. It is called the Void Century. And almost everything interesting in this story eventually traces back to why it was hidden. Every history book in this world simply skips it. Scholars are taught to treat the gap as a curiosity rather than a wound, an unfortunate absence of records, nothing more, certainly nothing worth dwelling on. Children are not told to wonder about it. Most adults have absorbed the lessons so thoroughly that they no longer think to ask why 100 consecutive years of human history would simply fail to leave a written trace, when every century before and after it is documented in exhaustive detail. That is the first and most important thing to understand about the Void Century. The silence around it is not natural. Silence this complete, this consistent, maintained across 800 years and enforced by the most powerful institution in the world, is not the absence of a story. It is the presence of an enormous effort to keep one particular story from ever being told. The name itself is telling, not the lost century, which would suggest an accident of history, records misplaced or destroyed by time the way old things sometimes are, void. A word chosen deliberately to describe an emptiness rather than a loss, as though the people who named it wanted future generations to think of those 100 years as simply not having happened, rather than as a period whose records were taken from them on purpose. Even the language built around this gap was designed to discourage curiosity rather than invite it. Scattered across the world, buried in ruins, sunk beneath oceans, and hidden in places few people are equipped to reach, there exist carved stone tablets called poneglyphs. They are nearly indestructible, not fragile records that crumbled with time, but deliberately built to outlast empires, governments, and the people who would prefer they never be read at all. Each poneglyph is inscribed in an ancient script that almost no one alive can read. The skill required to translate them is rare enough that an entire culture was built around protecting and teaching it in secret, passed down through families willing to risk everything to keep the knowledge from disappearing. The world government has spent the better part of a century trying to destroy this knowledge entirely, not by reading the stones and burying the truth, but by eliminating anyone capable of reading them in the first place. This is an important distinction. They are not hiding a secret they already know. They are trying to make sure no one can ever uncover it again. The material the poneglyphs are carved from resists nearly everything. Ordinary tools, fire, the slow erosion of centuries underwater. Even overwhelming physical force struggles to do more than chip the surface, and the few methods known to actually destroy one require a specific, exceptionally rare power that almost no one in the world possesses. This means the government's strategy was never about physically erasing the stones themselves. It could not be. Instead, the entire campaign has been aimed at the much narrower, much more achievable target, the people. If no one is left alive who can read the script, the stones might as well be blank rock. The knowledge does not need to be destroyed if the capacity to access it can be destroyed instead. This also explains why the poneglyphs were never simply collected and hidden in one vault somewhere, which would have been the simpler solution if destruction were the goal. They remain scattered, sometimes in plain sight, sometimes guarded fiercely by the very kingdoms whose ancestors carved them, treated as treasured historical artifacts by people who have no idea what they actually say. The government's relationship to the stones is less about controlling objects and more about controlling literacy itself, a much stranger and more total form of censorship than simply locking history away in a vault, because it does not just hide the past, it makes the past permanently unreadable to everyone except the very few people willing to risk their lives learning a dead language no school will teach them. The clearest demonstration of how far the government will go happened on an island called Ohara, a peaceful, scholarly community built around archaeology and the study of history, home to a renowned library and a population of historians who wanted nothing more than to understand the past. When their research crept too close to the truth about the void century, the government's response was not a warning or an investigation, it was annihilation. An order called a Buster Call, a designation usually reserved for the most catastrophic threats imaginable, was issued against an island of scholars and children. The destruction of Ohara is one of the starkest moments in the entire story, precisely because the threat being eliminated was knowledge itself. A single survivor escaped that day, a young girl named Nico Robin, who carried both her unique ability to read the ancient script and the trauma of watching her entire home erased for the crime of wanting to understand its own history. She would spend years afterward as one of the most wanted fugitives alive, hunted not for violence, but for what she might someday be able to read. The bounty placed on her as a child was staggering, set not because of anything she had done, but purely because of what she represented. A government willing to assign a child a bounty larger than most hardened criminals will ever see in their lives is a government revealing exactly how afraid it actually is. The fear was never really about Robin personally. It was about precedent. If one survivor of Ohara could grow up and eventually piece together what the island had learned, the silence the government had spent so long enforcing would have failed at its single most important task. Ohara itself had not broken any law before its destruction. It was a legitimate, recognized center of historical research, visited openly, its scholars respected enough in academic circles to be consulted by outsiders on unrelated questions of history and archaeology. What changed was not their conduct. What changed was how close their honest, methodical research had crept toward a conclusion the government could not allow to be reached. The island was destroyed not for breaking rules, but for being good enough at its actual purpose, understanding the past, to eventually have understood the one part of it that was never meant to be understood at all. The full picture remains incomplete even deep into the story, pieced together fragment by fragment across different poneglyphs scattered around the world. But what has surfaced paints a picture the world government clearly does not want assembled. There was once a kingdom of immense influence and unity, existing alongside others during the Void Century, that stood for something the eventual victors of that era found unacceptable. There was a war, or something like one, that reshaped the political structure of the entire world afterward. And there is the matter of the 20 kings who founded the world government as it exists today, an origin story that the government itself treats as more sacred and untouchable than almost anything else in its power. Whatever happened during those 100 years, it was significant enough that the people who emerged in control of the world afterward have spent every year since making sure no one could ever fully reconstruct it. What makes the fragments so difficult to assemble is that no two poneglyphs were carved with the full picture in mind. Each one seems to record a piece of a much larger account. A treaty here, a name there, a single event described from one limited point of view, scattered deliberately or simply by the chaos of whatever happened during that century, across islands separated by oceans and governments, and decades of additional history layered on top. Reading one poneglyph rarely answers a question outright. More often it reframes an earlier fragment, or raises 3 new questions for every one it resolves. This is part of why, even generations into the search, with multiple skilled scholars devoting entire lives to the project, no one has assembled more than a partial outline of what actually happened. There is also the simple, practical problem of access. Many poneglyphs are not sitting conveniently in libraries waiting to be read. They are embedded in collapsed ruins at the bottom of the ocean, sealed inside volcanic terrain, or guarded by natural and supernatural hazards severe enough that reaching them at all requires the kind of resources usually only available to powerful pirate crews or government fleets. This means the search for Void Century truth has never been purely intellectual. It has always also been a physical expedition, requiring exactly the kind of strength, resilience, and willingness to risk death that turns quiet historical research into something that looks, from the outside, indistinguishable from high seas adventure. Before the Buster call reached Ohara, the island's lead researcher, Professor Clover, understood with total clarity what was coming. He had spent his life studying the poneglyphs and the lost century they described, and he knew exactly how the government had always handled people who got too close to the truth. He made a choice in those final hours that defined what Ohara's destruction actually meant. Rather than trying to flee or burn the research to spare the island, he and his fellow scholars used their last free moments to make sure the knowledge itself would not die with them. They gathered everything they understood about the void century, the script of the poneglyphs, the fragments of a buried kingdom, and handed all of it to the one person small enough, fast enough, and trusted enough to possibly escape, an 8-year-old girl who had been quietly absorbing their lessons for years already. Clover's last act as a teacher was to tell Robin to live, not to fight, not to take revenge, simply to survive long enough that what Ohara had learned would not be erased along with the people who learned it. It is a small, devastating moment, and it reframes everything that follows. Robin did not become the world's most wanted historian by accident. She was handed that responsibility deliberately by people who knew they would not live to carry it themselves. There is a particular cruelty in how the government chose to frame this afterward. Rather than acknowledge that an island of historians had been destroyed for asking questions, the official record characterized Ohara's scholars as dangerous criminals who had been planning to use forbidden knowledge to threaten world stability. The people who actually died protecting a child and a body of historical research were rewritten, in the only version of events most of the world would ever hear, into villains who deserved what happened to them. Robin grew up not only carrying their knowledge, but carrying the knowledge that almost no one else would ever know the true story of the people who gave their lives so she could escape. Clover was not a young man making an impulsive last stand. He had decades of experience, a reputation built carefully over a long career, and every reason to understand exactly how the world would remember him once the official record was written. He chose to spend his final hours teaching anyway, fully aware that history itself, the very subject he had devoted his life to studying, was about to be rewritten specifically to erase the truth of what he and his colleagues had actually done. It is a quiet, devastating irony, a historian in his last act becoming exactly the kind of inconvenient truth that history is so often used to bury. Long before Ohara fell, Robin's mother, Nico Olvia, had already dedicated her own life to the same impossible search, traveling far from her daughter for years at a time, chasing leads about the void century across dangerous waters, driven by the same scholarly hunger that would eventually cost her own life as well. Olvia was not simply an absent parent in this story. She represents the generational weight of this mystery, a question that had already consumed one life in the family before it consumed the island that raised the next one. Robin grew up watching the cost of this search firsthand in the empty chair at the dinner table, long before she understood what her mother was actually searching for or why it mattered enough to be worth so much absence. When Olvia herself dies alongside the rest of Ohara's scholars, the inheritance becomes literal as well as intellectual. Robin does not just inherit a research project. She inherits a debt across 2 generations of women in her family who decided that understanding the truth was worth nearly anything it cost them. There is a brief, quiet moment before the destruction of Ohara where Olvia, having finally returned home after years away, tells her daughter something close to an apology, an acknowledgement that she had chosen the research over the years she could have spent simply being present. It is one of the few tender moments in an otherwise unrelentingly tragic chapter of this story, and it matters because it shows that the people chasing the Void Century's secrets were not reckless or indifferent to what the search cost the people who loved them. They understood the price. They paid it anyway, believing the truth was worth more than the years it took from them. Olvia's research had taken her, by the time of her death, into some of the most politically sensitive territory connected to the Void Century, close enough to the truth that her presence at Ohara almost certainly accelerated the timeline of the government's response. In a sense, Robin lost her mother twice. Once to years of absence chasing the same answers Robin herself would later spend a lifetime pursuing, and then permanently in the same act of destruction that took the rest of her adopted family of scholars. The grief never had room to separate cleanly into one loss or the other. It arrived as a single compounded wound. Among the more unusual pieces of Void Century evidence is something that at first glance seems to belong to an entirely different kind of story, a massive bell, ancient beyond easy explanation, discovered in a kingdom that exists literally in the clouds. Scipea, home to a people called the Shandia, holds fragments of history that connect directly back to the same lost century everyone on the surface has been forbidden from discussing. The Shandia's own oral history describes their ancestors being driven from a homeland on the surface of the world centuries ago, forced upward into the sky to survive, carrying with them fragments of memory about a world that does not match the official histories taught below. Their bell, ringing across centuries, audible for miles, a literal sound traveling forward from the Void Century into the present, becomes in its own strange way as significant a piece of evidence as any poneglyph. It suggests something the government's erasure campaign clearly was not able to fully contain. Pieces of the truth did not stay buried in one place. They scattered. They survived in songs, in bells, in oral traditions passed down by people who had been pushed to the margins of the world and therefore overlooked by an empire focused on controlling the historical record at its center. The Shandia's displacement itself raises an uncomfortable question the story never answers directly. Why would a people need to flee upward, permanently, rather than simply relocate elsewhere on the surface during the Void Century? Whatever drove an entire population into the sky appears to have made the surface itself unsafe for them specifically, which implies a conflict severe enough and targeted enough that an entire culture judged it safer to abandon solid ground altogether than remain anywhere within reach of whatever was happening below. Centuries later, their descendants still treat the bell as sacred, still maintain traditions about a homeland most of them have never seen, carrying forward a memory the government never managed to reach. The bell's sound itself carries a kind of symbolic weight beyond its historical value. In the present day, it becomes a literal signal used to call for help, rung across the sky to summon assistance during a crisis on the island. A relic of a buried century, inherited by people exiled from the world that buried it, repurposed centuries later as a tool of survival and solidarity rather than simply a museum piece. It is one of the few pieces of Void Century history that never stopped being useful, never stopped being actively part of the lives of the people who carried it forward, a continuity the government's erasure campaign never managed to interrupt. Among the poneglyphs scattered across the world, a special set exists that does not describe history at all. Called road poneglyphs. These stones instead function as something closer to a map, each one recording the coordinates needed to reach the final island, Laughtail, where Roger and his crew once stood and read the truth no one since has been able to read again. 4 road poneglyphs exist altogether, and all 4 are required to complete the route. The government understands this as clearly as any pirate does, which means the search for Void Century truth and the search for Roger's treasure have, by the story's design, become the same search. Anyone who eventually reads every road poneglyph will not just find a legendary treasure, they will stand exactly where Roger once stood and have the opportunity to learn whatever it was that made him laugh rather than despair on his way to execution. This is part of why the government's fear runs so deep. It is not only that someone might learn what happened during those 100 years, It is that the path to that knowledge and the path to the most coveted treasure in the world are, by design, the exact same road. Roger himself is believed to have gathered all 4 road poneglyphs over the course of his career, which means his entire voyage to the final island was, in effect, both a treasure hunt and a research expedition running in parallel the whole time. He reached Laugh-Tale already carrying pieces of the Void Century puzzle that almost no one else alive had ever held simultaneously. Whatever he read once he arrived was informed by everything he had already gathered along the way, which may explain why his reaction at the end was laughter rather than shock. He had likely spent years assembling the context needed to finally understand what he was looking at. This also means the government's official strategy toward the road poneglyphs has always been somewhat contradictory, and the contradiction reveals something about how torn they are between 2 competing fears. Destroying or hoarding all 4 would prevent anyone from reaching Laugh-Tale and learning the truth Roger learned, but it would also mean giving up any chance of reaching the treasure themselves, recovering it under government control, and managing whatever the final island reveals on their own terms. Centuries of indecision on exactly this point have left road poneglyphs scattered across the world rather than secured in one place, which is precisely why the race to find them remains open to pirates, the government, and everyone in between, all chasing slightly different versions of the same destination for reasons that do not fully overlap. One detail recurs enough across the story to matter enormously: a kingdom that, according to every official record, never existed at all. Not destroyed and remembered as destroyed, erased so thoroughly that its name does not appear in history books, its flag does not appear in archives, and even mentioning it carries enormous risk. This is a different and more unsettling kind of erasure than simple destruction. It suggests not just a war that was won, but a story that needed to be replaced entirely, scrubbed so completely that the official version of events has no room left for what actually happened. The implication, never stated outright but present in every careful silence around the topic, is that this erased kingdom's story might directly contradict the legitimacy the world government has relied on for 800 years. What makes this particular erasure so unsettling is its completeness. Most historical cover-ups leave traces precisely because total erasure is so difficult. A surviving letter, a half-remembered name, an inconsistency that careful readers eventually notice. This one barely has any. The few clues that exist come almost entirely from indirect sources. A phrase on a poneglyph that does not quite fit the rest of the official narrative, an old symbol that keeps resurfacing in places it should not. A handful of people across centuries who have each in isolation sense that something does not add up without ever managing to compare notes with each other. An erasure this thorough does not happen by accident. It happens because someone with enormous sustained power over centuries decided it had to. One detail makes the erasure even stranger. The symbol associated with this kingdom occasionally resurfaces in places that should have nothing to do with each other. Old flags in distant territories, fragments of architecture, a recurring motif scholars keep noticing without quite being able to explain why it keeps appearing. A truly perfect erasure would have caught all of this too. That it didn't suggests either that the people responsible ran out of time before finishing the job, or that the kingdom's influence before its destruction had already spread further and touched more of the world than its erasers ever managed to fully trace and remove. A natural question is why any of this still matters to the people living in the present timeline of the story, most of whom have never heard of the Void Century and have no particular interest in 800-year-old politics. The answer is that erased history does not stay contained to the past. The structures built on top of it, who holds power, who is considered a threat, who gets protected, and who gets sacrificed, all still rest on the foundation that erasure made possible. Robin's entire life was shaped by it. Entire kingdoms' relationships with the government today are shaped by assumptions inherited from a story most people were never allowed to question. This is, underneath the pirates and the devil fruits and the high seas adventure, A story about what happens when the people who win a conflict get to write the only version of it anyone is allowed to remember, and what it costs, generations later, to even ask whether that version was true. Consider how many ordinary people in this world go their entire lives never questioning any of it. They are not unintelligent or incurious. They simply have no reason to doubt a history that has never given them cause to doubt it, taught consistently from childhood by every institution they have ever trusted. That is precisely how an erasure this large survives for 800 years, not through constant visible enforcement, but through the much quieter work of making the false version feel too obvious, too settled, too uninteresting to ever question in the first place. There is something almost comforting, in an unsettling way, about how ordinary this dynamic feels, even outside the story. Most people living under any long-established order rarely interrogate its founding myths day to day, not from naivety, but because daily life rarely demands it. The Void Century mystery works as well as it does precisely because it mirrors something true about how power actually maintains itself anywhere, not through a single dramatic lie, but through a long, patient accumulation of small omissions repeated across generations until the omission itself becomes indistinguishable from simple, settled fact. It is worth sitting for a moment with what the decades after Ohara actually looked like for the one survivor capable of reading what had been destroyed. Nico Robin was 8 years old when her home was leveled for the crime of curiosity. She spent the following 20 years moving from crew to crew, country to country, hunted continuously by an organization that considered her existence itself a threat worth mobilizing fleets over. She was forced more than once to work for people who frightened her, simply because the alternative was capture and likely execution. She learned not to get attached to places or people, because every place she settled eventually became unsafe, and every person she let herself care about became a liability the government could use against her. By the time she joined Luffy's crew, she was someone who had functionally stopped expecting safety to be a real option for her life. What changed that was not a clever escape or a powerful protector. It was a crew of strangers who, upon learning exactly how dangerous she was to associate with, chose to keep her anyway. It is difficult to overstate how significant that choice was to someone who had spent 2 decades being treated as a liability by everyone she met. During those 20 years, Robin kept reading anyway, in stolen moments, in libraries she was not supposed to have access to, in ports where she risked exposure simply by asking the wrong librarian the wrong question. She built her reputation as one of the few living people who could translate the ancient script almost entirely through this kind of furtive, dangerous self-education, no mentor, no protected academy, just a girl and then a woman who refused to let what Ohara taught her die along with everyone who had taught it to her, even while every authority in the world was actively hunting her for knowing it at all. This period of her life also shaped the guarded, often sharp-edged persona she presented to almost everyone she met during those years. The warmth she would eventually show Luffy's crew was not the default setting of her personality during the fugitive decades. It was a capacity she had to slowly rediscover, having spent 20 years treating every new relationship as a potential liability rather than a possible source of safety. Trust, for Robin, was not a starting position. It was something that had to be earned back, piece by piece, after 2 decades of evidence suggesting it would only ever get her hurt or get someone else killed. Piece by piece, across oceans and decades, and at extraordinary personal cost to the people involved, the true shape of the Void Century is being reassembled, not by armies, by scholars, by a handful of survivors, by a woman who lost everything as a child and chose, against every reasonable instinct towards self-preservation, to keep reading anyway. That choice, to keep asking what actually happened, even when an empire has made it dangerous to ask, is, in its own quiet way, as significant as any battle in this story, some of the most important resistance to power has always looked less like a fight and more like refusing to stop reading. What makes this particular mystery so satisfying to watch unfold is how patiently the story has built it. Fragments appear chapters or even years apart from each other, in completely different parts of the world, delivered by characters who have no idea they are contributing to the same picture. Piecing it together requires the kind of attention usually reserved for the most devoted scholars, which feels appropriate, given that the people inside the story doing exactly that work are themselves scholars, refusing, against an empire's best efforts, to let 100 years simply disappear. And perhaps that is the most enduring shape of this entire mystery, not a single dramatic reveal waiting at the end, but a long relay of people across centuries, a dying captain who laughed instead of despairing, a professor who spent his final minutes teaching, a mother who chose research she knew might cost her everything, and a daughter who kept reading anyway, each one passing forward a fragment of the same refusal to let power decide, permanently, what the rest of the world is allowed to know about its own history.